Hey, what's going on, guys? How is everybody doing? Childe, Tartaglia, or Ajax, any one of these names can be used to describe number 11 of the Harbingers of the Fatui. Often referred to as one of the more dangerous members of the Harbingers, he can act completely innocent and harmless 1 minute, then revert to his unpredictable, bloodthirsty personality in the next. That is all trumped though by the love of his family, who he sends care packages back to from time to time, filled with money, gifts, and letters to fill the familial hole of which he has left. We'll be talking about the stats you should be prioritizing, how to build your artifact sets, what weapons he'll get the most performance from, and what talents you should focus on. We'll be judging these from a free-to-play level all the way up to an endgame primary hero. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and hit the notification bell, that way you never miss a video, and join our Discord. Link is down in the description below. Now, with that out of the way, let's jump right into the video. Childe can be a very intimidating character to learn when first looking over his kit. All his talents read as walls of text and cannot be the clearest at times. We'll be looking to clear up exactly how his skills and, more importantly, his Riptide triggers work later on. But first, it's important to talk about what roles you should be looking at for Childe to fill before even understanding his kit, as that will answer the fact for you whether you should be prioritizing wishing for him or saving your pity on another 5-star hero. Childe should primarily be thought of as an AoE main DPS. He works a bit differently than some of your other primary carries such as Diluc, Razor, or Zhao, which is the reason I would classify him as an AoE carry. Most of their carries are built around doing massive damage with their main attacks to take down 1 or 2 enemies at a time, if they're close enough. Childe is a bit different. He can of course hit very hard, as any hero can do in this game if built a certain way, but where he shines is in group combat with lots of enemies around due to his Riptide mechanic, which will continuously do AoE Hydra damage. Because of this, Childe isn't always the best option when looking to take down single target bosses, as his main strength is moving Riptide from enemy to enemy. With only one target, that makes that a little bit difficult. This being the case, being a DPS that isn't always the best option, can he be used as a supporting hero when not your main DPS? Yes, though again he's kind of limited here due to how his kit works. Unfortunately, he's not the best Hydra applicator. Actually, he's probably the worst until you get his Constellation 4, since until then he can't reapply Hydra while off the field. But he does get used for his burst on one-shot teams because his burst scales so high, and if used in range stance will regenerate some energy, making it less necessary to have another Hydra battery. Most of your time playing Childe will be learning how to properly manage his skill, as the cooldown is an aspect of his kit that takes some finesse. But in order to discuss that, we need to take a deeper dive into his talents to learn just what makes him tick. Childe's basic attack fires 6 consecutive shots with his bow, and holding the attack will allow you to aim your shot before firing, though if we're being honest, you'll almost never use this attack at all. The only reason you'd even level up this talent is for the extra Riptide burst damage. Before we get into Childe's skill and burst, let's first discuss what exactly Riptide is and how it works. Riptide is a status effect applied by Childe in 2 different ways. 1, by using a charge attack in his bow stance, and 2, by getting critical hits while in his melee stance after unlocking Ascension 4. You'll know Riptide has been applied because of the symbol placed over the enemy. You can extend the duration of the base version of Riptide after unlocking Childe's first Ascension passive, which extends the duration by 8 seconds, up from the initial 10. Once Riptide has been applied, there are 4 different triggers that can occur on an enemy. There's Riptide Flash, Burst, Slash, and Blast. Riptide Flash will occur whenever an enemy affected by Riptide is hit with a charged bow attack and deal AoE Hydra damage. This will be the least utilized of any of the Riptide triggers. Next is Riptide Burst, which will deal AoE Hydra damage and apply Riptide to nearby enemies not already afflicted when the Riptide affected enemy dies. Both of these instances of damage will scale with your basic attack level. Next is Riptide Slash, which will be triggered when in melee stance, dealing AoE Hydra damage, and can occur every 1.5 seconds. This damage scales alongside your skill level. Lastly, there's Riptide Blast, which will trigger whenever you hit an enemy that is already affected by Riptide with your burst, adding on to the already absurd levels of damage his burst can do. This will clear your Riptide status, but luckily it's easy enough to reapply. In understanding all of this, we can see why Childe is such a potent AoE carry, especially when combining Riptide Burst and Riptide Slash. Killing one enemy pushes Riptide to all nearby enemies, which you can then hit them in melee stance, triggering Riptide Slash, which does a bunch more AoE Hydra damage. It sounds confusing at first, but there are really only 2 you have to worry about, Burst and Slash. So what is the melee stance that I've mentioned several times already? Well, Childe is unique, as of the release of this video anyway, in that he's the only hero in Genshin Impact that can use both a ranged weapon and a melee weapon. Now, you do always have to equip him with a bow, but using his skill will unleash Childe's melee stance, dropping his bow for instead 2 daggers, which will then deal Hydra damage rather than physical damage. His auto attack scaling will also change to now use his skill multipliers. So don't get confused like I did and think you need to level up his auto attack to make his melee auto attack stronger. It doesn't exactly work like that. The other unique aspect of Childe is that his skills cooldown directly relates to how long you stay in melee stance. You can stay in your melee stance up to 30 seconds, and at any point you can deactivate it by switching out to another party member or activating his skill again. Your skill cooldown can range anywhere from 6 to 36 seconds, all the way up to 45 if you let his skill run out naturally, which I do highly discourage. If you don't know how long you have left, a flashing symbol will appear above Childe's head a few seconds before your 30 seconds are up, so that you can make sure to deactivate his melee stance manually. Even though he has a max duration of 30 seconds, don't let that trick you into thinking you always have to use it for that long, because remember, that's a long cooldown on the other side of that 30 seconds. What I like to do instead is to first use all of my support's bursts or skills, then switch to Childe and take advantage of any reactions or Hydra resistance reductions you may have set up. It may be anywhere from 10 to 20 seconds before your support's abilities wear off, which is when I would then switch off of Childe to then reapply your support's bursts or build them back up by gathering energy with their skills. The idea is to treat Childe more as a quick swap carry, maintaining field presence for no more than 15 to 20 seconds in melee stance so that he's always ready again after burning through your support's skills. Lastly, in Childe's kit is his burst, which can unload massive amounts of damage in a small window, especially when paired with Pyro for a substantial vaporized crit. His burst has 2 different variations, one for his range stance and the other for his melee stance. In his range stance, his burst will deal AoE Hydra damage and apply Riptide. It'll also refund a third of the energy required to cast, which can be used before entering melee stance to quickly apply Riptide and get a boost of energy to build up for another burst inside of melee stance. Once in melee stance, Childe's burst changes from applying Riptide to now removing Riptide and doing a large extra chunk of damage in the process. This version of the attack does not refund any energy. Childe's final ability is to increase your party's normal attack by 1 level through his passive talent, Master of Weaponry. In most cases, this sounds better than it actually is, because remember, in most instances, Childe will be our main DPS, and while he plays that role, his normal attack only increases Riptide burst for us, and our supports will mostly be using skills and bursts, not auto attacks. So this is more helpful when he plays support, though the barrier for him to play that role optimally is locked behind Constellations. When prioritizing talents, luckily you only have 2 to focus on, which should make farming a bit easier. His skill and burst are his only relevant talents. In the case you're using him as a carry, it'll make the most sense to level his skill first, as this will be where most of his damage comes from. Even though his burst does scale incredibly high, it already starts pretty high, so it's not the end of the world to leave this behind a bit in order to sink more weekly resources into your Raging Tide. If you're lucky enough, or a big enough whale, to go for multiple constellations of Childe, here's what you can expect to look for. Constellation 1 will decrease the cooldown of Childe's skill by 20%. Constellation 2 will provide Childe with 4 energy every time an enemy affected by Riptide is defeated. Constellations 3 and 5 are our typical skill and burst promotions. Normally, we'd like to see the burst at level 3 and skill at level 5, but we actually see a bigger DPS jump leveling his skill. So if you're lucky enough to get Constellation 3, that'll be a nice twist for you. Constellation 4 will trigger Riptide Slash every 4 seconds if Childe is in his melee stance, or Riptide Flash if he's in range stance or off the field. These instances do not affect how often they can occur though through his skill. So essentially this constellation adds an additional AoE Hydra attack every 4 seconds. While good for Childe as a DPS, this is what really opens up his supporting capabilities, as now enemies will have Hydra reapplied every 4 seconds during the 18-second window. A common issue that can occur though is that if you mismanage the timing on this constellation, it can eat your Pyro application, losing you vaporized damage on your burst. This will be most relevant on bosses, since smaller enemies are likely to die before your burst is back off cooldown. In this 20-second window though, before his burst is back up, you can expect to see 5 slashes or flashes, which at talent level 6 breaks even, given that the slash that ate your Pyro application doubled its damage. Lastly, Constellation 6, the one that makes Childe his best self. Whenever Childe uses his burst in melee stance, He resets the cooldown of his skill once he enters back into range stance, completely eliminating the long cooldown time that so many people find annoying. Childe has a couple arrangements of artifacts that you could make work, and they all revolve around Heart of Depth. Heart of Depth was essentially made for Childe. The 2-piece set increasing hydro damage by 15%, but the 4-piece set increasing overall normal and charged attack damage by 30% for 15 seconds. And yes, that does affect his damage in melee stance since his skill is modifying his basic attack. As good as this set sounds though, it can actually be outpaced by a 2-piece set with a 2-piece set of Gladiator's Finale, with the caveat that you are not standing inside of a Bennett ult. Because of the interaction with Heart of Depth, that Bennett's attack boost is applied before the Heart of Depth percentage is taken into account, you can get a much larger boost in damage going with a 4-piece set. However, if you are not running a Bennett, because the attack boost from Gladiators will also affect your Riptide damage and burst damage, it edges out over the 4-piece Heart set. So take that into consideration before spending all your time farming a full 4-piece Heart of Depth set. The other alternative is a 2-piece set of Noblesse Oblige, though this will be outdamaged by both the previous 2 sets. The upside here is that it's much easier to farm than Gladiator and will definitely outdamage both if using Childe as a support only for his burst. For artifact stats, the only piece that's heavily dependent on your overall build, including teammates, is your time piece, as the best options here will be either attack percent or elemental mastery. So how should you go about choosing? The big factor here will be, are you pairing him with Bennett? If you aren't, it'll almost assuredly be better to run attack percent, but because Bennett can provide you with so much supplemental attack, if you are running him, elemental mastery is more than likely the way to go. This can also depend on what weapon you're using, as a weapon like Skyward Harp with its sky high base attack will make it less likely to need to stack even more attack percentages. If you're pairing Childe with a hero like C6 Fischl, where almost every hit will spark Electrocharged, it also makes sense in a case like this to run elemental mastery over attack. Use these guidelines to better assess for your team which is the better stat. For his cup, we want hydro damage, and to circlet, either crit rate or crit damage, dependent on how your other substats and weapon land. Technically, it is a bit better to stack more crit rate because of his Ascension 4 passive, but that does not mean ignore crit damage. We still want to stay close to a 1-to-2 ratio, but if we have to make a decision between one side being a bit heavier than the other, crit rate should be the priority. Childe's weapons. These have seemed to elude people as to exactly which bow is best and how they rank, but here's how it breaks down. At the top, the king, Skyward Harp. It's not even particularly close. If you have this weapon, it's Childe's best in slot, even if you have an R5 Rust. Remember that Skyward Harp has a sky-high attack, crit rate is a substat, crit damage on its passive, it does additional physical damage on its passive. Both the crit rate and damage affect his skill damage, it affects his Riptide damage, it affects his burst damage, it affects all of these, and Rust only actually affects his basic attacks. It doesn't affect the Riptide damage or his burst damage at all. And that also doesn't take into account that a lot of Childe's highest damage dealing combos actually include charge attacks, and Rust actually makes those a bit weaker. It still doesn't beat an R1 Skyward Harp. There's a bit of a discussion to be made here between Viridescent Hunt, Rust, and Alley Hunter. Technically speaking, at R1, Prototype Crescent is actually the strongest bow. However, and this is a big however, it requires you to start your combo with an aim shot to a weak point, and practically speaking, that's not always an option. Without that boost, it falls behind Rust and Alley Hunter, since their stats are close otherwise. So this will be our budget option. Between Rust and Alley Hunter, Rust just barely squeaks ahead, and honestly, it's so close that they basically fill the same slot. Whichever is a higher refinement that you have, go with that one. Now, why is Viridescent Hunt above both of these? Well, assuming you have some crit damage investment, the added crit rate is obviously vital to a damage boost, and of course the added factor of increased rate of applying Riptide, but what pushes Viridescent Hunt as king of 4 stars for me is the passive ability. Since we know Childe is an AoE based carry, we want to bring enemies as close together as possible so that all of our AoE damage can double, triple, or quadruple depending on how many enemies we can cluster together. It's also far easier to acquire a Viridescent Hunt, needing only 1 month purchase of the Battle Pass. The last option to consider here is Stringless, not for a DPS build since his bow will not affect Childe's damage in melee stance, but as a burst support. There is an argument to be made for this weapon though, as its passive will increase the damage of your Riptide procs, though in general it's still better to go with either Rust, Alley Hunter, or Prototype Crescent. In conclusion, Childe can be a very fun hero to play with an interesting change of pace, and of course, he throws numbers around everywhere. There aren't a lot of choices right now for a hydro carry, but for the time being, if you're looking for one, this is your guy. Hopefully you guys have found this guide useful and it will help you in building your own Childe. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and hit the notification bell, that way you never miss a video, and join our Discord. Link will be down in the description below. But guys, that's all I have for today. Hopefully you did enjoy, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.